Hello, everyone, and welcome to
Tracing Text
with Anton,
and Sylvia.
coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee. And today, we're on spring break here, so we're recording live from the library. You could hear a pin drop here. There's no students around.
None at all.
And, it's a good place among books.
Right.
To talk about an author that we've talked about before, but we're going to take a different approach this time around. Sylvia has chosen the topic for this 14th episode of Tracing Text, and so I'm going to let her tell us a little bit about who it is, maybe refresh our memory a little bit about this author, and then we'll start talking about the work.
Yeah, so we're going to focus on a short story called El hombre que siempre soñó, and that particular title can be interpreted in two ways, which is actually quite significant for the story. It's the man who always dreamt, or the man she always dreamt of. And it's from a collection called Ningún, reloj, cuenta, esto. No clock will recount or narrate this. And it's by Cristina Rivera Garza, who we talked about in our first episode.
That's true, a long time ago.
Yeah. So we thought, well, I really like this particular short story, so I thought, why not, revisit this author? We can, talk about her background briefly, since we have talked about her before, and then we can go right into the story itself.
So anybody who's out there and may not remember that early episode of Tracing Text, you can still go out on iTunes and find that early episode. I don't think it's on YouTube, because at that point we weren't still posting them on YouTube yet. But
yeah, but I have the actual recording, so I could send it to you, and we could upload it to YouTube as well. So we can have that, so you could listen to both Cristina Rivera Garza episodes if you like.
And if you don't have the time to go back and listen to that at this point, we could maybe refresh the memory of our listeners about who Cristina Rivera Garza actually is.
Yes, she's a contemporary Mexican author. She was born October 1st, 1964 in Matamoros, Tamaulipas. And for those of you who aren't very familiar with Mexican geography, that's right on the border with Brownsville, Texas. That's the northeast part of Mexico. Her best-known work is the work that I talked about in episode 1, and that is Nadie me verá llorar, or No One Will See Me Cry. And it has garnered much critical acclaim, including an award called the José Rubén National Book Award in 1997 and the Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz Award in 2001. She's very prolific and writes all sorts of prose and poetry, including, I believe, that she also did like an opera as well. So she's done all sorts of writing. And today, the short story that we're going to be looking at, the collection, Ningún, reloj, cuenta, esto, it's not translated into English, but that isn't to say it won't be, because she's been widely translated. In fact, her work has been translated into English, Portuguese, German, Italian, and Korean. So, like I said, she's very well regarded. She's now a professor at the University of Houston, and it's actually interesting that she is part of a new program at the University of Houston that teaches creative writing in Spanish. But she has taught at other places like the UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico, and the Tec of Monterrey, the Toluca campus, and the University of California, San Diego. So that's kind of a little bit about her and her life.
Now, it's the second time you bring up Cristina Rivera Garza to talk about her work. Well, what is it exactly about her work that seems to be so interesting to you?
Well, I think that her work is really compelling in the sense that what I have read, I haven't read all of her novels and everything about her, but they're all very distinct, and her writing is very strong and unique. But what I like about her, the author, is in fact that she is a border author to a certain extent. So she does. There are some aspects that do comprise or in some ways address that that constant back and forth and kind of the liminality between places.
And since she was born on the border, I guess
Yes,
that
exactly.
may have a lot to do with that.
Yeah, so so in that sense, I think that's why I find her interesting. And, but like I said, the novel Nadie me verá llorar is historical fiction. It's actually based on a dissertation she wrote because she's a historian by training. So she has a PhD in history. So it's very much tied to actual events, whereas what we're going to talk about today, the short story, is much more magical. And although and very intertextual, it's very different in that respect. It's not historical fiction by any means or a stretch of the imagination.
Well, let's talk a little bit then about this short story, El hombre que siempre soñó. Again, a little bit of ambiguity there when it comes to translating that title into English, because the ambiguity is there in Spanish very clearly. And one thing that seems to be pretty interesting to me is that there is an intertextual relationship here between this text and The Little Mermaid, which my daughter would love to hear about because she loves the Little Mermaid movie. But of course, we're not talking about the movie, we're talking about the actual fairy tale, which is another one of the topics you love.
Yes, I love fairy tales as well. And this is kind of connects my fairy tale love with femme fatale. So it's all together. So that's probably why I like the story so much. But yes, you're right. The intertextual elements in this story is not like a light intertextual. It's very clear that there's references to the Little Mermaid. And so I want to kind of briefly go over the Little Mermaid first before we get into our story, because I think it enriches our understanding of the story. So I am referencing specifically Hans Christian Andersen's version, which was published in 1837. So The Little Mermaid in 1837. And most of us probably realize or know that it's about a mermaid who desires to become human because she falls in love with a prince, And we also need to remember, however, that this written version is a culmination or it's a kind of a retelling of many other folkloric stories or versions out there that have been circulating, not just in Denmark, but throughout the world. There are versions of The Little Mermaid. And so Hans Christian Andersen, this is the time in the 19th century where folklore is really important to like national identity, and they kind of take these stories and write them into and put together collections and then are published and become very popular. So we see these recurrent themes and patterns, as I said, in other versions. So one of the things I want to look at some of the critical elements in Andersen's version, and that's that the Little Mermaid, she's the youngest and prettiest of 6 sisters, and I think it's important that her underwater home reflects her own beauty, and her inherent goodness is really important, and the benevolence of her father's kingdom. And it's important also because, I've done a little more studies here and there, and I think that there is also a connection to the sirens of Greek myth, which I haven't, really gone so far in that, but it's there as well. She enchants all of those around her with her delightful song. So we know that the Little Mermaid likes to sing, and she's very enchanting. But even though she's beautiful and she has a beautiful voice, she's not completely happy or content. And so in a way, this is an inherent flaw in her personality. And I think that when we look at that, in a way, I think it reveals a little bit of a misogynistic undercurrent, because it puts a blemish on her character in some way.
Or maybe an undertow in this.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. Exactly. In the story, not only does she yearn for love, but we do see elements of her budding sexuality we see this underwater flower bed where the flowers are red, and it says, like I'm quoting, the mermaid's plot was round like the sun and contained flowers as red as his rays at sunset. And so the flowers suggest a sexual energy that has to be channeled and contained in some way. But at the same time, her garden, because she has a underwater garden, it demarcates, like her how she should behave in some form or fashion. She can't freely express herself. And then I would say she's a character that is in love with love. And when she sees this marble statue of a beautiful boy, she's captivated by that. And so she goes on to plant a rose-colored weeping willow. So then Andersen's Little Mermaid naively believes that her blind and utter devotion, because she eventually sees the prince, the one that, the statue is after this real prince, that because she has this undying devotion that, she will have reciprocated affection, and as a result, she will also gain an immortal soul. But to be able to, have a relationship with the prince, she has to appear human. So she goes to the sea witch and exchanges her voice for a pair of human legs. The exchange is that her tongue has to be cut off. And if that wasn't bad enough, every time she walks, she endures much physical pain. It's like if she were treading upon sharp knives. And I think this could be interpreted in two ways. It could be a way of demonstrating submissiveness and self-sacrifice, or we could look at it as a societal critique of a culture in which a woman only has value if she has a man's approval. So she's seeking his affection, his approval. But ultimately, the prince does not fall in love with the Little Mermaid. So I don't remember the Disney. I did see it, but it's been so long. So I'm only talking about the Andersen version. So in the Andersen version, when she fails to have the prince fall in love with her, she loses that opportunity to have a human soul. And her older sisters, in an effort to save her, they collaborate with the witch. And in a final attempt to rescue the lost mermaid, they tell her if she plunges a knife into the prince's heart, then it will restore her to her mermaid nature. But, of course, she still loves him, and she refuses to do that. And so instead, she's transfigured into a cool breeze. And I have a quote here. It says, into a cool breeze whose task it is to refresh children who languish in the heat. She receives a point toward a soul for each child she refreshes. However, every time a child misbehaves, no matter how small or innocent, the infraction points are deducted. And that quote is a rephrasing done by a study by Maria Elena Soliño called Women and Children First, Spanish Women Writers and Fairy Tale Tradition. And it basically makes the Little Mermaid is stuck in limbo. She will not get to heaven because every time the children will misbehave more than they will behave.
Yes, they do.
And so it is an unhappy ending, not a happy one. People sometimes overlook that part. They're like, oh yeah, she at least is in limbo, and for every good deed she gets a point. But at the end of the day, she's stuck there.
And that is where the Disney version differs. Being
yes.
a movie for children, obviously, the happy ending is not like that.
Right.
It's quite different, in fact. And obviously, if for all of you out there who may have seen the movie, because you have kids, or maybe when you were younger, Of course, the typical fairy tale ending of a Disney movie is what you find in The Little Mermaid, in which, of course, she gets the approval from this man, the prince, and then she actually becomes human. And she leaves the bottom of the sea, and she doesn't live under the sea anymore, but she actually gets to marry the prince, as any self-respecting Disney princess should.
Right. And so here she doesn't get the prince, and on top of that, she doesn't gain her, immortal soul. She's stuck in this limbo state. So it's a cruel ending. So that's the Little Mermaid. So we're going to move on to the actual story, El hombre que siempre soñó. And in contrast to Andersen's cruel ending, we see that Rivera Garza kind of takes the story and she gives it a twist. So there are differences. It's her ending, we'll see, is neither cruel, but it is quite different. But her story introduces Alvaro. He's the main character, and the story begins by him describing his musings as to the loss of love he experiences towards his wife, Fuensanta. So his relationship with his wife seems like it's no longer a passionate relationship, or it seems like it's lost its passion. But at the same time, at the beginning of the narrative, there's a little bit of ambiguity. Although he does mention his wife Fuensanta, the text also makes it a little bit difficult to know if maybe this indifference that he feels is possibly a feeling he has towards an unknown woman, which sounds crazy because if you don't know someone, how can you feel indifferent towards them? But the narrative is clearly ambiguous in that respect. It starts off and saying, siempre le pasaban miles de cosas extrañas con ella, which means many strange things happened to him while he was with her. And we're not sure, again, if that refers to his wife or to the woman he anticipates will also return. So there's this circularity that is difficult to kind of disentangle, like the various threads. Now, there's a critic, Gerardo Bustamante Bermudez, who says that, Rivera Garza uses the double or significantly. And that's really important because he notes how Fuensanta, Alvaro's patient and understanding wife, provides many of the opportunities that lead to his rendezvous with Irena. Irena is the other woman who he will have an affair with.
But not at the beginning of the story.
Well, we don't know
about her.
It could be, but that her name has not appeared yet. So it's interesting how it's the wife who kind of sets it all up. And then the very name of the mysterious Irena connotes the term sirena or siren, which in Spanish means both mermaid and siren. So Bustamante Bermudez never says, like in his interpretation, he never says that Fuensanta functions as Irena's double. But as I look at this, I see that Fuensanta literally means like fountain and holy. So it's like her name means holy fountain. So it's almost as though she's the source of this watery creature being Irena. I think that's significant. We know that Alvaro is out of love, but when the story tells us this, the narration also notes that Fuensanta is happier, she smiles more, and sleeps better, which is contradictory depiction, perhaps, of a woman who has lost a man's admiration. Like, she doesn't really care. Unlike the Little Mermaid, who, like, I think it's interesting, really is fixated on winning the prince's affection. All of Fuensanta's actions demonstrate a calm self-possession, and she doesn't have this anxious yearning for approval. There's this self-containment. And in some of my research, I've noted how it's similar to some of the chthonic goddesses, the primordial chthonic goddesses, who often are connected to mermaids or these watery, but also earthy type of primordial beings.
What do you mean exactly when you say chthonic? That's even hard to pronounce.
I know. It means like literally of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So both the water elements and earth elements are combined. And there's an interesting study by a woman named Gillian M.E. Albin. She says, she does a study on these primordial goddesses. She says, before God, there was a belief in the goddess. She is seen as an aquatic force emerging from the original state of chaos or watery depths from which life emerged. She is also chthonic of the earth. She is aerial, either by association with the birds that accompany her or as a bird herself. Her winged form is also seen in the winged serpent or reptile, the dragon. She is creatrix and founder of all that exists, connecting the birth-giving qualities of woman with the female gender.
When she says Ariel, it's Arial, not Ariel, the mermaid.
Yes,
the
that's a
Disney
good point. That's a very good point that you've clarified for our listeners. And when she mentions this Ariel part, this is how it also is then connected with the Greek sirens, because in the very early depictions of the sirens, they're more like birds than mermaids. And right now I'm actually reading an interesting study on how these images changed during the medieval period, at least in Western culture, from these creatures having wings to tails, and sometimes in this transition period they would have both. It's just to go back to what we were discussing, so in a sense we were talking about how she's not anxious about winning Alvaro's affections again. She's completely she has an emotional integrity, so she doesn't feel any anxiety as to his loss. And I think that is significant. It also ties her to those primordial goddesses because they were said to be, and it's hard to even pronounce this word too, parthenogenetic, so they had asexual reproduction. They don't need a man. So it puts her back into that category of these primordial goddesses. When we look at Fuensanta's demeanor, she does flow like a gentle spring in the narrative, and since it is because of her that Alvaro takes a brisk walk, a late night walk in the Mexican city of Toluca. And it's important to note that Toluca is known for its cold climate due to its high altitude. That plays into the story quite a bit. So as Alvaro is walking along a steep street, he passes by a window and he hears a perceptible moaning of a couple who has just finished making love. And he looks through this window slit and he sees, this is the first time he sees Irena. He doesn't know it's Irena, but he sees her in deshabille, and he sees this lightest silk sky blue gown barely covering her body, and sees like one of her legs kind of suggestively stretched out, and she's also wearing this pastel blue, that is, the heel that she's wearing is also pastel blue. And then it's at that moment that Irena makes eye contact with Alvaro, and supposedly she sees him, and he gets frightened, and he returns to the hotel where he's staying with his wife, because they're originally from Mexico City. Maybe I should have mentioned that. So what's surprising is after this incident, the next morning when he goes down for breakfast, his wife is already having breakfast, and he sees his wife with Irena.
So supposedly his wife, that's quite the turn there. That's quite the twist.
Yes, it is.
It's almost, I don't know, it's almost uncanny, really.
Yeah, it is uncanny. Like, she's there having breakfast with her as well. And supposedly, like when they're having breakfast, Irena, she introduces herself, and she lives in in a secluded cabin in a forest, like up high in the mountain, and she claims to be doing biological research for a university in Arizona. That's her job. She's a biologist.
So that's not what she was doing the night before.
Maybe. So, and I think it's like, that seems like kind of a funny, like, anecdote, like her profession, how is this mermaidy in any way?
Biology.
But, well, maybe biology. It may seem irrelevant, but it actually plays I think, a big role, because I found this really interesting stuff when I was, like, doing the study on this story. She's working, the character Irena in the story is working to discover, like, an organic, non-toxic solution to counteract the fungus causing potato blight, which is the same fungus that caused the Great Irish Famine. And you think, well, whatever, it was just a random detail, right? But then I started, like, looking online, and I saw that the American Museum of Natural History in New York posts, and it has this webpage called Becoming Mermaids. And I'm going to quote this from what I found on this website. It said, mermaid sightings were reported in Ireland as recently as 1910, when one was seen in County Clare. One local said that mermaids were a bad omen, as the last sighting in 1849 was followed by the Great Potato Famine.
So there's the connection.
Yes,
yeah.
And I'm thinking that Rivera Garza found this and said, well, this is what our Irena is going to do for a living. She's trying to eliminate the fungus that caused the potato blight and therefore the famine. So this, like, tidbit of folklore could lead one, it's almost silly, but it makes it seem that the Little Mermaid escaped Danish waters, because after all, she's Danish. She swam by Ireland at some point, and then ultimately makes her home in a Mexican mountain lake. That's kind of like what happened. This is how Irena ends up in Mexico, I guess. So as if to clear her name, Irena makes it her goal to eradicate the pathogen that caused this terrible famine. And then it's also a little bit ironic that she's doing this research in Arizona, because Arizona is, we know in Spanish, means arid zone, so it's a dry place.
There's no water.
No, it has nothing to do with water. So we see kind of this, I think it's a little way of teasing with the reader.
You're listening to a new episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
And today we're bringing together Hans Christian Andersen with Cristina Rivera Garza and even Walt Disney. We're talking about The Little Mermaid and this short story entitled The Man Who Always Dreamt, or The Man She Always Dreamt Of, in Spanish, El hombre que siempre soñó, which you can find in the book collection of short stories, Ningún reloj cuenta esto, no clock recounts or narrates this, and it's not translated into English, as Sylvia said before, but if you read Spanish, it's out on one of the most important publishing houses of Spain, Tusquets Editores.
Exactly.
Let's keep talking about this because it's really, really interesting.
I told you it was twist. We had a twist in the story.
That uncanny, that uncanny part that about going down to breakfast and seeing Irena right there.
Right.
I'm sure Alvaro had absolutely nothing to eat that morning.
No, I think he was like dumbfounded and was like, "Oh my God, what's happening here?" So later in the story, they do meet up, and Alvaro and Irena have consummated their affair. He learns that, in fact, Irena has lived in Copenhagen. Surprise, surprise. and so that's why I say, like, this is not a coincidence. It's a reference to Hans Christian Andersen. And she had attempted to leave an abusive husband, Hercules, which Hercules is Hercules in English.
So, another name that's not merely by chance.
No, it's of course.
If he was abusive and his name is Hercules, I wonder how abusive he could really be.
Right.
I'm kind of worried for this woman.
Right. So It's not a reference to the Anderson tale, but we do see it a reference to Greek mythology, and we can kind of think about it as he has a strong grip on her. So we can look at it from that perspective. So then we go on, it's all about their situation, and she tells him how he abused her. At the same time, it moves to a different scene where he's at a dinner party with his wife, Santa, and other friends of theirs. And they have this one particular friend, Nelida Cruz, who's in the book. She's an anthropologist. And this anthropologist, who is a make-believe, obviously, has recently published a monograph, entitled Sirenas de Tierras Altas, which translates into mermaids of
the highlands.
The highlands.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. So it is through this character that I think that the author reinforces the intermingled narratives that formulate both Fuensanta and Irena, since her work and even the name suggests a narratological intersection. Mm-hmm. For me, the name Nelida is similar to the word naiad, which is the Greek nymphs that presided over fountains and wells and springs, etc. So there is a connection right there to mermaids or, water creatures. And then her last name, Cruz, cross, it's again that intersection. So I thought, this name tells us we see this as an intersection of the two. And I think the author is also making fun or poking fun at academics.
Yes.
Very much, because it's a quote academic publication focusing specifically on a tiny mermaid who inhabits the lagoons around the dormant volcano crater in the Nevado de Toluca, which is, Toluca was the town where he first encounters Sirena. I mean, not Sirena, but Irena, sorry. It gets confusing. So, and also it's the place where Irena had been conducting some of her research, because that's why she says she lives up in the forest in that cabin. And according to local legend in this book by Nelida Cruz, her diminutive size does not diminish in any way her ability to drive men towards madness in their effort to seek her out.
And that's where the femme fatale creeps in.
Exactly. And now you see why I like this story.
I can see the connection and the crossing there between the mermaid or the siren and this devilish woman or femme fatale that
right, so
enters
she's
the
small,
scene
but devilish. So, and it's so when you read the story, it's interesting that in this make-believe academic text, this Nelida Cruz quotes prominent theorists, anthropological theorists like Geertz and Bakhtin and Tusquets. And it kind of makes it seem like this is a real text. So we can say this is some sort of paratext. It's not real, but Rivera Garza creates it to kind of give an objective, it makes it look as though it's a real text, supporting the fact that in fact there are these creatures that live in El Nevado de Toluca.
So a text within the text.
A text within the text. We know that he's captivated by Irena, so he seeks her out, and he knows he's not quite sure of her existence. So he seeks her out again. He returns back to Toluca after that first meeting, and after their consummation, he returns to the house where he first sees Irena, and he runs into her mother, Antonia, and when Antonio answers the door, he confuses Alvaro with Rolando, Irena's twin brother. That's really bizarre. That's
another double right there.
Another double, but that he is similar to her. So yeah, there's another double, and so her mother's absurd confusion makes Alvaro's physical similarity to Irena even more uncanny, since his resemblance to her suggests that she may be functioning as his feminine double and is merely a figment of his imagination. So he's already going crazy.
So it's possible that Irena doesn't really exist within the story.
Exactly. So, determined to discover the truth, he returns to the mountain cabin, and there he finds Irena battered and bruised, supposedly at the hand of Hercules, that abusive husband. He seeks medical treatment at a nearby hospital in Mexico City, not far from his home, and he stays with her for a while. And while Irena is convalescing, he tells us, he finds out that his wife is pregnant. And that is, it's very clear that Fuensanta and Alvaro really have been apart. So it's, again, interesting that Fuensanta, she, again, is connected, like she is able to get pregnant without Alvaro. Mm-hmm. So either Fuensanta is Irena's double, or she also has some sort of magical qualities. But Alvaro discovers that Irena's bond or love of Hercules, she tells him that she is known as being a woman of fragile love affairs. So she admits to him that she's a little bit flighty, that her affections are fleeting and superficial. And then he also learns that Irena left behind her daughter in Denmark.
So she had a daughter.
Yeah, she did have a daughter with Hercules, supposedly. And then as the story moves on, Hercules calls Alvaro and requests to meet him. So this is, the supposedly very jealous ex. And this meeting between the two serves to challenge some of the existing narratives, since Hercules claims that it was Irena who beat him and not the other way around. So Irena being the abusive one. And it also reverses, gender roles there.
But there's no way to tell who's telling the truth.
No, not at all. At this point, it isn't. And so after this ludicrous encounter, he returns to the hotel where Irena has been recuperating, only to find out that she has left, and leaving him to question her existence once more.
So I guess one of the problems here in the story, as far as the plot itself, is this ambiguity as to whether the characters actually exist within the text, or
right.
if they're just an invention of other characters
right.
within the text.
Right. You're never sure, because in some respects, all of the characters except Alvaro could very well be figments of his imagination. So once, I mentioned that his wife gets pregnant, and he is forced to confront fatherhood, and his wife has a son named Mariano.
So there's no explanation at all about how it is possible that Fuensanta has had this child when they have been estranged for a while.
Exactly. And there's nothing to suggest that Fuensanta had her own affair. So it's just like, now she's pregnant, now he has a son, Mariano. And so then 2 years later, again, it's Fuensanta who creates a situation, like the right, events that lead Alvaro again to this elusive siren. Again, it's Nelida Cruz. She's having a book signing in Toluca. So they drive to Toluca, and they, to go to the book signing, and the couple goes and the son Mariano goes. But instead of going to the city, he keeps driving up the mountain in search for Irena. And so basically he goes crazy because his wife is with him, and so is his son. It's totally absurd.
But he seems to be focusing more on this irreal or unreal character that might exist or might not exist, and not on the two characters that are actually there with him.
Right. So that's why it's, it makes us question the fact of whether they are real or not. So again, he's driving up the mountain, and when he goes past the dirt roads leading to Irena's cabin. He gets out of the car with Mariano in his hand, supposedly, and bursts open into the cabin. But she's not there. The books, the furniture, her sketches, all her other stuff, it's not there. And
so there's nothing there.
There's nothing there that tells you, like, this place belonged to Irena. Instead, he finds a group of indigenous-looking people occupying her space. And there's an instant, I think, where he realizes this is not real. This is not this didn't happen, or this person doesn't exist. And for a second, you think he's going to snap out of it, but in fact, that's not what happens. Instead, it's the old woman that's there tells him that his daughter is there. Or not his daughter, but rather Irena's daughter.
Oh.
And Irena's daughter is named Mariana.
Oh.
So it's a double of Mariano. And I mean, that, again, that's really strange. And he also, the old woman who is named Antonia, also says that he is her lost sister, which is also very strange because that would make their relationship incestuous. So whether, and Irena is lost, nowhere to be found, so her loss, whether real or imagined, is irrelevant because she has successfully lured Alvaro. So he's going crazy.
So towards the end, it's still not possible to know if she exists or not, because on the one hand it looks like she doesn't because there's nobody there, but then there is some suggestion that she has been there.
Right, because that old woman, a random old woman, says that this is his long lost sister has his daughter Mariana, and so. At the same time, Fuensanta runs after him, and she kind of maintains that narrative logic that has carried the story so far, and she urges Alvaro to return to the car with their son instead of becoming angered as a result of Alvaro's affair. So she's she never has any, like, I think what I would call a normal reaction.
Because this is now that she finds out
right.
that this affair has been going on.
Right.
She hasn't known this for all these years.
Supposedly not. So she finds out about the affair, but she's just like, just come back to the car.
But at the same time, she may have had an affair herself since she's
had a child.
A child with perhaps no participation from her husband.
Right. But, I mean, that's like, if we believe it, like, if we believe that it's all kind of magical, then no. But yeah, I mean, from a realistic point of view.
Is there any indication that it could be magical, or is this something that you read into this?
I read into it because of her connection to those, like, chthonic goddesses that are able to, reproduce without any masculine agency. But other than that, no, there's nothing to suggest that it's magical. So they get into the car, with Mariano, Fuensanta and Alvaro, and he's driving back home, like, it seems like in a rush. But once on the road, he notices Mariana is dead through the rear view mirror.
She's in the car?
She's in the car. And that gives it, I think, an element of horror as well.
Yes.
I mean, that would be really scary. All of a sudden, she's in the car. They didn't put her in the car, but she's there.
She may be in the car, or she may be in the car in his
imagination. Exactly. Yeah. But instead of interpreting this incident as supernatural, Bustamante Bermudez, who's one of the critics, he says that Mariana is without a doubt Irena's double, or a facet of Fuensanta's split personality. That's how he sees this child.
What do you think about that? Is that something you believe, or do you share the belief of this critic, or maybe not?
On the one hand, I can see how it's a double and a figment of his imagination, but I think since the story has these magical elements, well, why can't we suspend our disbelief and just accept that there is a supernatural explanation? I mean, to some extent, I agree with him, but I think that it's also possible that Mariana is in fact in the car. It's possible
Now,
within the context of the story.
when it comes to supernatural explanations, the difficulty is whether they could be borne out by the text or not. And so, obviously you're talking about the connection with the goddesses and all of that. Do you think the reactions of the main character of Alvaro could also justify the fact that maybe it is magic that's at work here, or some sort of magical realism or something like that?
It could be something like magical realism, to some extent, because as a reader, I question Irena's existence, because there are many times that it just seems very unlikely that she exists. It's all in his head. He's imagining this whole story of seeing her that first time when he's walking down the street and seeing her at breakfast. On the other hand, through a little slit in the window, it seems quite unlikely. But then at the same time, unless Fuensanta is also a figment of his imagination, how does this character, bring her in? Because they did have breakfast together, for example. And they did see her having that first time and found out that she's a biologist and that her home institution is in Arizona. How would that be? So that's why, in some ways, I accept some of the magical
Well, the
components.
reason why I was asking that is because without having read the story, it sounds really interesting and convoluted, and
it is convoluted,
with lots of twists. But one wonders if if it were possible that, and again, without having read this, just from listening to you talk about the plot here today, one wonders if it is possible that with Irena perhaps being a figment of his imagination, maybe the affair that he has had with her, he was actually having with his own wife. And then the child could be born out of that.
Right.
But again, I don't know.
In that sense, you're right, because if they're doubles and Irena is Fuensanta, this is all like some elaborate, kind of game, basically. And so, yeah, you're right with respect to that. The only thing is that, based on what has happened, we see how, he's kind of moving. He's going mad. I mean, he is definitely not. We see this descent into madness and his sense of alienation that's growing. So at the end of the story, when they've left, they're in the they left in the car, and then he sees Mariana. The text then seems to loop around to the very beginning, when the narrative opens with Alvaro sensing Irena's return. Remember, I told you in the beginning, Irena hadn't been mentioned, and it seemed like he was talking about his wife, but
he was talking about strange things that always happened to him.
But then it's like, well, maybe it's some other woman. And so it kind of loops around, and it almost parallels that the beginning, and it closes that with that sense that he is sensing that she will return. So this, in a way, it's an anxiety that he feels, kind of the same way that the Little Mermaid feels anxiety, but instead it's the man feeling this anticipation for.
But that idea of limbo that you were talking about is there in both cases, because the Little Mermaid is in limbo in a way,
and
so
he too is in a limbo.
Is he, because he can't really fully embrace his family life.
No, he can't,
because he's still obsessed with
Irena,
who may or may not exist.
Exactly. So that's kind of a twist in who ends up in limbo. And in this case, it's Alvaro and not Irena.
Well, in case you've forgotten, you're listening to a new episode of
Tracing Text
with Anton
and Sylvia.
And today we're talking about Cristina Rivera Garza for the second time. This is the only author so far that we have brought twice, and there's quite a bunch of reasons why we've done this, because it sounds like a very interesting story, and one that is sure to thrill, and hopefully the readers that might actually get a chance to read this story in Spanish. El hombre que siempre soñó, the man who always dreamt himself,
Right.
or the man she always dreamed of.
Right, because I think in a sense, we talked about how he could have created all of these characters and he's just gone mad. On the other hand, it could be Irena who has dreamt him up, and she's controlling the whole narrative.
So as it is usually the case with Rivera Garza, there's a lot of ambiguity in these stories.
Right.
You may not have an answer for this, but which one of those two translations would you favor, if any, for the title of this story?
Well, I think that
And there may not be.
there might. I think it can go I think it can go either way. But I think that one of the things that I do think very clearly is that Álvaro is not the one with agency here. It's Fuensanta or Irena, because he's kind of at the mercy of what they do controls or shapes his decisions, his emotions, his reactions. He's the one who's trapped, not Irena. Irena, even though supposedly she tells him this elaborate story about how Hercules abused her, well, Hercules then tells otherwise. So, and you have to wonder a little bit and believe Hercules to a certain extent. There are some suggestions to suggest that it's Irena who is physically aggressive. And although Fuensanta doesn't do anything really to abuse him physically, there is some sort of psychological manipulation, because she manipulates all of the events so that Irena and Álvaro meet, and then kind of they cross paths, and they cross paths again because they go to this book signing at the end. So in that sense, I feel that the women in the story are controlling the story, or the author being a woman, but it's the women controlling the story rather than in The Little Mermaid. It's kind of, I don't feel like The Little Mermaid ever has any real agency, or she loses it at the end for sure.
She seems to be all too willing to lose it.
Right.
Too.
And here, it's the guy is at the end. He's in limbo and delusional.
I would say that book signing is absolutely fascinating to me, because what academic actually has a book signing that's attended by tons of people?
I know. That's why I'm saying she's making fun of academics. There's little things there that tell you, like, she wants to totally make fun of how academics take themselves quite seriously.
Well, it's very possible that a lot of our listeners have not read this book. It's a collection of short stories, and in order to wind down this 14th episode of Tracing Text, I would like to ask you, Sylvia, as I always do, to sort of sell the book to our listeners out there, so to speak. What would the listeners, or of this episode, or the possible readers of this book, what would they find in this collection of short stories? Ningún reloj, cuenta esto.
I think that this collection is interesting because many of the stories have this element of the uncanny. They are not all as supernatural or magical as this one in particular, but they all leave, I mean, if you like closed endings, this is not the collection for you. But if you like to, it leaves a reader with you have to give it give it some sort of interpretation. Think about what the characters are going through. So in that sense, I feel like it's a very rich collection that allows for your own imagination to, to be enriched in some way. And in that sense, I think it's a beautiful collection of stories. So That's why I would recommend Ningún, reloj, cuenta, esto.
If you like closed endings,
That's not for you.
The episodes led by Sylvia are not for you either, because I can't remember a single closed ending that you've brought to tracing texts.
No, I guess not. Most of them allow, the reader has to kind of come to his or her conclusion and then make up his or her mind about what happens. And I don't think there is a correct answer, and I don't think it's necessary for there to be a correct answer. I think what's important is to kind of look at it to look at old stories in a different way. And I think reworking. And I think that's what in this collection and in this story in particular, I think that's what the author's aim is to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, to give it a new twist, and then to kind of subvert some old ways of thinking. And if that happens, then I think she's successful.
Again, the title is Ningún, reloj, cuenta, esto, only published in Spanish by Tusquets editores, and the author is Cristina Rivera Garza, that we've had today on tracing texts. Now, Sylvia, remind the listeners how they can get in touch with us if they so wish to. Of course, this episode will be available on iTunes, on Podomatic, but also on YouTube.
That's right. So if you wish to email us and give us feedback or comments, which we always welcome, you can email us at tracingtexts@gmail.com. That's tracingtexts@gmail.com.
And this time I had it written down.
Yes, because sometimes it's hard to think about such a long and spell it out. But tell us, Anton, what are you going to be talking about in episode 15? Do you have any ideas?
Yes, I was inspired by all the supernatural elements that you brought in today. And so I think, even though we're going to travel back in time to the second half of the 19th century, I'm going to be bringing a few short stories as well. Really short stories in this case, fairly short, which have supernatural elements of different kinds, and which were written by one of the lesser-known Spanish writers of the late 19th century, whose name is Pedro Escamilla.
Okay.
So he was a playwright. He wrote a few novels, but he also wrote, I think, most interestingly, really short stories, many of which have supernatural elements to them. And we're going to choose just some of the most interesting ones, and we can talk about those for the next episode of Tracing Texts.
Well, that's really exciting. I'm looking forward to our next chat.
Same here. This has been a new episode of
Tracing Texts
with Anton
and Sylvia,
coming to you live from deep in the heart of the state of Tennessee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you next time on
Tracing Texts. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.